Yeah, sure. So you've covered my day job. So I manage the sales team looking after large customer sales for the Middle East and Africa and Google. But my career started 20 something years ago. So I worked in a non-profit in Zimbabwe as my first job out of college, which was interesting. And I think that's where I got a bit of a bite for the sales life. I loved chasing a target, which was great. And then I moved over to Ireland just under 19 years ago. I moved to Ireland and initially went into market research, did that for a while, but I was looking for something a little bit more stretchy at the time. So found myself in Google and initially started as a TVC, so at the very bottom of the rung of the ladder, and worked my way up, working with the UK market for a while. And my dream job at the time was definitely going to be doing something with Africa, because obviously I said from Zimbabwe. So when the opportunity came up to manage the African team, jumped at that. And I guess I've been doing that ever since, which is great. It's really rewarding to be able to see businesses grow based off of the work that they do with us. So very fulfilling. Passionate about diversity. I'm also a massive sponsor of the Black Googler network that we have within Google. So I've been involved in that community for a really long time, mentoring, sponsoring more junior folks as well. So doing quite a few career panels like this internally as well. And just really pushing the agenda when it comes to underrepresented groups, because we've got a bit of a journey to go in that regard. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Great. Now on to Paul. Do you mind giving us a bit more about who you are, your story, and what you're doing now?
Sure. Thanks, Dennis, and thanks for inviting me. So yeah, Paul Cleal, born and brought up in London, on the edge of London in Croydon. My father was from Cameroon, and so like Pendo, strong links to Africa, and I spent some time there as part of my career as well. I guess the bit of my career that I'm best known for before the non-executive roles that I started back in 2017 is as a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC. I began my career really in the public sector, worked in local government for a while, but then became a corporate financier in PwC back in 1996. Got into it through getting involved in infrastructure finance in Croydon Council, and then I guess came to the attention of the Treasury here in government, got a secondment there, met a Pricewaterhouse partner who was working there on secondment at the time, and things went well, and I got approached to join the firm. 5 years later became a partner, and then over the course of 16 years as a partner did I guess 4 different careers. One was a continuation of my sort of finance work, but after about 5 years and having really helped to start the firm's diversity initiatives, got asked to become what we would now call the Chief People Officer of the firm, on the board of the UK firm. So that was my kind of second main role. And then towards the last few years of my time in the firm, I was head of the government and public sector practice for the UK, worked on various global teams as well, and then was a member of the board of the Africa practice, and for a short time based in Lagos in Nigeria. Left the firm in 2017 to pursue this non-exec career, which started really with a lot of work in social mobility and education, and over the last couple of years has been focused particularly on, as you said, Dennis, NHS, obviously fascinating through the COVID period, a very difficult time, the police here in London, the Met, and of course football, the Premier League, where the main focus of that is really the follow-up to the Black Lives Matter campaign led by the players, and the work to continue the campaign for equality in sport and in society more generally as football takes a leadership role.
So you're not that busy then?
I just squeeze you in, yeah. Always a pleasure.
All right, so the first question I'll actually direct it towards you, Paul. So in terms of self-promotion, like, just to give a bit more context, like, why is it important to self-promote for your career?
Well, I've had the conversation a lot with people over the years in my teams, and actually it's very noticeable that all the people who have asked me about concern about self-promotion have been either or both women or from different ethnic backgrounds. It's not typically a problem that white men in organisations seem to have in terms of wanting to self-promote or being prepared to do it, but a lot of other people see it as politics and don't like it. So it is quite a cultural thing, and from different backgrounds it's not natural for people. From some cultures especially, it's particularly uncomfortable. So I recognise the difficulty. I think what has to be said though is it's a reality. I mean, firstly, if other people are going to self-promote, then you need to think about the implications of that. You want to succeed in the organisation. And then secondly, there's a more general point that I think became more obvious to me as someone who was also quite, I guess, shy backwards about coming forward, you might say, initially, is that I realised later when I was the boss and running teams that I couldn't see what people were doing. There were too many people around under my responsibility, and I couldn't know exactly who had done what or what individuals had contributed to a team effort. So unless you tell the boss what you've done, probably no one else will. You might be lucky. Some good soul might say, actually, it wasn't me, it was him. Dennis did all that great work. But in my experience, that doesn't happen that often. So you have to fill in the gaps that the boss has in terms of their knowledge of what's going on. And I think of it from their perspective. They can't possibly know what you're doing. And of course, I'd have said all this if you'd asked me a year or two ago. But after a year of working remotely, where people got absolutely even less chance of seeing what you're doing, self-promotion, of course, in the era of COVID has become even more important. And so that's I think why it's essential. Partly as a kind of keeping the player field level for people who are going to self-promote anyway, and partly because bosses can't possibly know. And your job is partly to help them to know that you're doing a great job.
And Pendo, following on from that, when are the best moments to self-promote, in your opinion?
First and foremost, because what you have is some people who do wait for a peer review time or self-assessment, and they put in all their great achievements. But I think something Paul said is really important. Is it's important to make sure your boss knows what you're doing, and if you have an ongoing dialogue, a lot of the time, say in some companies, things like performance ratings are assigned before self-assessment might be done or something like that. So you want to have your brand in terms of how great you are existent, not just at pivotal moments, but kind of an ongoing dialogue. So one thing that I would do quite often is have a running doc, for example, with things that I think have done really well, just kind of highlighting that my manager also has sight into, and that's worked out. Because sometimes you also forget, you might be like, that wasn't that important, but you mentioned it to your manager, they're like, wow, that was actually a really good thing, so just make sure that dialogue is there. I think it's important to understand that you own your own narrative when it comes to your career and what you're doing. So if you shy away from telling your story, then no one is going to know, to Paul's point, right? So it is important to keep this conversation going, figure out the best way for you and make it authentic as well, because there are certain people who, well, they send an email to the whole team regularly and they become the braggers. You don't want to be that person. What you want to do is people to recognize the great work you do and assess what you're sharing, so that people read those emails. Otherwise you become that mute the thread kind of person. So I think it's super important to, again, just continue throughout the year, throughout whatever period you're working with a group or project on, that you're talking about your the great achievements that you've made. Don't shy away from it.
Interesting. Okay. Following on from that, what are the best mechanisms to actually self-promote? Do you only do it when you're asked to do it? Do you only do it, say, end-of-year reviews, monthly catch-ups, or do you do it more consistently, more subtly? What are the best ways to do that, Pendo?
I would say consistently, and in terms of mechanisms, so you've got different things. It could either be, you're speaking up and talking to your manager directly about what you've done. It could either be obviously via email. It could be having a conversation with, a skip level and making sure that they're aware of the, some amazing things that you've done. Use those kind of engagements intentionally as well when you're trying to accelerate your career. And I think the last thing would just be, again, just keep a record of it, so that you're not forgetting the great things that you've done.
Great.
Paul, external validation, awards, recognition, all of those good things. Are they actually, well, as someone who's received a couple, are they actually useful to your career, or are they actually detrimental in the grand scheme of things? Because it's a double-edged sword from the way I see it. Some people are like, yeah, it's great, but then other people are like, well, if you've got all this time to be doing all this stuff, you've clearly not got time to do your job. So how does this work exactly? What are your thoughts?
There's no way that external recognition should be negative. So I suppose the question is, how do you use the external recognition and turn it to your advantage in some way? And I suppose one obvious point is you've got to ask yourself the question, if you get some external recognition, then how relevant is that to your boss and the organisation? Because if it's not relevant, then it's less likely to be useful. I mean, clearly, if you get external validation in the form of, in my profession in PwC, if I get external feedback from a client that's unsolicited to my boss, then that's probably the best sort of external validation. If I get an award for something that I've done outside, then that's less directly useful. But it may tell you something about my character, spread of my abilities. It may help people to notice something they haven't noticed about you before in terms of your ability to provide leadership or communicate or something like that. So I think they should always be useful, but it's partly, you shouldn't just wait for people to find out about it and then let them form an opinion about how useful that award or otherwise is. You should help them to understand what it is, but don't equally overdo it. I mean, you mentioned the word in the title is without bragging. Well, sometimes people go a bit over the top on social media and sort of tell all and sundry about it and have a sort of Oscar-winning type speech that's repeated sort of frequently, and that may irritate others somewhat. So I think you just got to retain perspective about it, and I think also bear in mind the sort of circles of influence here. I mean, there's people who are close to you in your team who are perhaps the key people to influence, but then there are kind of broader people in the organisation and externally as well who are important in your career in terms of their impressions of you. And you need to think about how those different audiences will appreciate different rewards. And often you'll find that, I found this quite a lot with things like diversity awards, that the people at the top of the firm think it's great and it reflects well on the firm as a whole, but the people more locally might, as you say, Dennis, get frustrated. They think that you're doing stuff that's detracting from your day-to-day work. So you've got to manage the different constituencies and think about how it will come across to them.
Pendo, do you have anything to add on to that, or?
No, I think it's absolutely spot on. I think this is where that the whole concept of authenticity, I think, for me is really important. It's absolutely celebrate your successes, like don't shy away from it, but just be mindful. I definitely am aiming to get an OBE thing at some point. I'm hoping Zimbabwe gets readmitted to the Commonwealth. I can also add that as well.
You mentioned success there. Talking about success, how do you deal with it when you surpass certain people, maybe who are your peers? But then also, how do you do it the other flip of the coin when someone surpasses you? How do you deal with those relationships and negating that side of things?
It's a really interesting one. I think from how do I deal with it? I'm proud of being able to accelerate my career, right? And I'm super proud of what I've done so far. And so for me, it's great because I feel that it's recognition of the hard work that I've put in. And so that's really important for me to kind of acknowledge. So I don't feel bad about it because it's not like it's undeserved the way I feel about it, right? I think even the concept of imposter syndrome has come in here and there, but overall, I'm like, no, when I get a promotion, I've genuinely deserved it. I've been promoted 7 times in Google. So for me, I'm like, no, it's because of the hard work I put in. It wasn't gratuitous at any point, right? But I think one thing to then answer the second part of your question is keeping an eye on my race, right? So my career has been mine, and I'm very much focused on, what are the things that I need to do to accelerate, my career, so hence the title. But the minute you start looking around, it's like, oh, that person's surpassing me, you're losing focus, right? Because that person is probably the person that is going in and having a great conversation with their manager. They are putting in the graft and they're getting where they need to be because they're focusing on where they want to get to. So if you allow yourself to get distracted by other people's success, you're just using energy that is just, you're expending energy that is unnecessary. Focus on things that are going to get you to where you need to go. And if it means that, you need to go in and say, well, actually, I'm really great, but I'd love to get a, stretch opportunity. I'd love to be able to do something else that I can then accelerate, have the conversation. But a lot of people then just get eaten up with jealousy and it's like, oh, everything's unfair. But you don't know what that person is doing. Often you only see probably just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what people bring to the office or bring to anything. So, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening underneath. And the same thing, maybe there are people that have looked and gone, actually, don't know what she's about. But, they don't see the graph that's being put in. I think it's super important to definitely focus on your own race and just, keep it going and keep focused.
Interesting. You touched on the point about jealousy, and I think I'll throw that towards Paul. We're all human, and obviously as people progress and do different things in their career, like you're bound to come across someone who may be envious or jealous of some of the work you're doing, not doing opportunities you're getting, etc., maybe nominations. How do you deal with jealousy and envy from peers and not let it affect you in terms of your own career?
Well, I think this is where you come back to how you handle receiving an award or receiving promotion, whether you receive it genuinely, humbly, or or make it look like you perhaps have won and they've lost. And I can remember one particular example of someone getting an award, a sort of external award, as you were asking about before, when I was in PwC, and it was pretty significant external recognition. It was recognition actually of their sort of other sort of heritage country awarding them a pretty high award. And I don't know, maybe they made too much of it, maybe they didn't. But certain people felt they had, and I think there was clear sort of envy in there. It comes back to the question about the validation of the external award that's been given. And if people feel that it's an award that they didn't ever have a chance to win, they're going to take it less seriously. Most of the time, I think, when people get promoted, it's they've deserved it. And the self-promotion, the kind of brand management, whatever you want to call it, is the icing on the cake. There has to be a cake to put the icing on, and that's the clear thing. You have to have something to talk about. So you can easily spot the people who are trying to promote when there isn't actually an awful lot to push forward, and it's those people who tend to get the negativity rather than the people who perhaps have just overdone it slightly. But there are some serious pushbacks, and I think people from I guess different ethnic heritages are probably more at risk of getting unfounded jealousy in organisations. I think I've seen that a few times, or their external awards that are important, worthy, are somehow not taken as seriously. That can happen, and that's a form of envy because it's kind of pushing down on someone's progress, I guess. So I think you just have to be, Pendo used the right word, authentic. All this is about building trust, building a genuine impression of what you're like, and sticking to that. And all the time you're building a genuine impression of being authentic, it's quite easy to stick to the same and get it right and be consistent. When you're trying to be something you aren't, it's much harder to manage that impression consistently. So be authentic, build trusting relationships, let people know what you're doing, and and enjoy what comes your way, without making it feel like it's at someone else's expense.
Definitely great food for thought there. We've got a couple of questions, so I will see if I can go to those now. The first question is from Mohammed. Can you tell us about a time early in your career when you self-promoted without bragging and it worked in your favor? Who would like to take that one first?
I'll take that. So I think early in my career, I was probably only in the company, Google that is, probably about a year or two. And I'd volunteered to work on a project that was not really related to my core role. It was a marketing project, because I was curious about marketing as a potential career journey for me. So worked on that one, and we managed to, when I say, actually, I should actually rephrase that, because so I led the project, because even then I was going we. But I remember working on this project, and we managed to generate, almost 7 digits in terms of incremental revenue for the company. And I was very much the person doing this with one other person, but the other person was just a support person on the project with me. And mentioning this as a by the way, because my manager knew I was doing the project, but I'd kind of gone, you know what, it's just what you do, the project was going great. And I happened to mention this is the impact so far, and got this real, oh, hold on. that's really quite interesting. And it ended up opening a lot of doors for me in terms of follow-on projects and challenges. I got promoted quite quickly after that. Because again, there's this, proactive, but what to me, I was just stating something, I was almost updating. I wasn't bragging, in my opinion. I was just, saying that. But I remember thinking I do need to let them know how well the project is going. And so it worked really well in my favor in that regard, because, you start, Paul, use the word brand, you start creating a brand of sorts quite early on in your career if you're going to stay in a certain company. And that definitely helps a lot with that.
Paul, do you have an example which you could share?
Yeah, I think it's. I would say that quite often in the world that I was inhabiting in professional services, then facts are sometimes in short supply, so you kind of have to fill them in. And sometimes just making sure that people see, in relation to the jobs you're doing, some real details about what's happening, so that you try and make it more objective rather than subjective at the end of the year. So where you have perhaps been involved in several teams, and Pendo used the word we and I, and I think quite often people who are less confident about self-promotion say we a lot, and we had it drummed into us when we were going for promotion interviews at PwC to use the word I, which I didn't feel was really appropriate or I was comfortable with. But I think it was the way that the culture I was working in was evaluating people. And it took me probably 2.5 years when I first joined. I joined at the beginning of '96. I didn't get promoted until mid-'98. So 2.5 years of not quite getting it right. And actually, I think where people started to see the picture was when I helped to make sure that they had the numbers that I was producing, the revenues I was attached to. And sometimes you've got to do that quite directly. But if all you do is send an email direct to your boss saying, here's the numbers, then that's kind of a bit blatant. So kind of working it into a conversation and hopefully getting them to ask for more detail, I found was a way that I could do it more comfortably. And I found once I cracked it, I got promoted sort of several years in a row after that, and made partner within another 2.5 years from there, 2.5, 3 years from there. So I think it took me a while to figure out culturally in the firm exactly what was appreciated, what good looked like. And that impression is quite subjective in many ways, but it keys off certain objective data. And the more you can find what that objective data is, what's important, the better the chance you have of giving them the right data and then getting recognised for it.
Great, thank you very much for that. The next question is from Kemi. Thank you both. How do you balance putting yourself forward for external recognition versus continuing to maximize your day-to-day role? Should you target these every so often in your career?
Well, I guess from my perspective, Dennis, if I take that first, I think I'm just thinking, I've probably never put myself forward for external recognition for anything. So someone else always has, and I've had a few. I don't even know who, even now, who put me forward for an OBE. It was a complete shock when I got it. So yeah, I haven't put myself forward for much in my time, which is probably an example of failure to self-promote in a way. But I've found that other people have wanted to frequently, and sometimes that's taken a bit of time, and I've had to write some stuff up. But I very rarely, if ever, been the source of it myself. I've probably been more effective at self-promotion sort of within my firm, and I guess that's where ultimately it seems to make the most difference.
And I would have to be in the Paul camp of I've never done it. It's I guess not something that I've thought about doing actively, but I guess, Paul, to you, I'm gonna maybe the second part of that question. Do you think that these are things that people should target ever so often in your career, given the awards that you've gotten over time?
Sorry, say again.
So that second part there. Should you target these ever so often in your career? Do you think people should do this, given the awards that you've gotten over time? Do you think that this is they were good use of your time, putting the stuff together, etc., etc.?
I think if you get asked to do something, someone puts you forward and there's a bit of a bit of work to do in terms of writing something up, then it shouldn't detract from your. It's probably a matter of an hour or two rather than longer. And actually, I mean, to take what Rob was saying towards the end of the last session, I mean, LinkedIn's a very good thing, and of course now we've all got a lot of the stuff on LinkedIn anyway, so it's not a bad discipline to actually regularly update some of that stuff and keep it fresh. So I think if you do that, so that when people do ask you to go and do an event like this, or to be put forward for an award, you've got something that's relatively on hand. Actually, that's good practice, and it shouldn't take you a great deal of time to respond to someone saying, we'd like to put you forward, can you give us something? So that's what I would say. I mean, I wouldn't. You shouldn't have to spend a massive amount of time doing it, because you should have some of that stuff to hand. Because if you can't tell people quickly why you're so good, then no one else is going to.
Thank you for that. I've got a couple more questions which have come through, but I'll quickly try and rattle through them. How do you self-promote? This one's from Tina, apologies. How do you self-promote when you have led a stretch project, i.e. done the heavy lifting and ran the show, without making others who have acted as advisors feel left out, or without your contributions being diminished?
Well, I'd say that partly comes back to the authenticity point. I mean, if you really have done all the heavy lifting and run it, then no one else really should feel excluded. But I think you ought to be confident enough also to recognise that others have helped. And this is where I think getting the balance is quite important, because some people, one way of bragging rather than self-promoting is to make everything look like it's your responsibility. And actually, if you give someone else a bit of credit, that often reflects very well on you as well. So I don't think there's a conflict. You need to get it right. But if you've done all the work, then, or most of the work, then most people will recognise that, and they'll be happy to have a commendation on the side. So yeah, authenticity and just being honest is, I think, an important part of all of this, and helping some others along the way at the same time. It's good for you too.
Yeah, I think that's totally spot on. And just to add to that, I think as I've gone through my career, the times where that has really been sort of a challenge, almost the balance has been a challenge, is when I was switching from an individual contributor to starting to manage. And sometimes you are the lead and you're doing a lot, but you also have either a team that you want to recognize and things like that. And I think a lot of people do struggle with that. It's like, how do I, either you're managing through others, but to Paul's point, I think if you give credit where credit is due, but also be very clear on what your participation in the project was, no one's going to take that away from you, right? But I think it is good to just give acknowledgement. But it's definitely, there may be a couple of times you work on a project and you'll get it right first, second time, whatever. And if somebody does give you feedback on no acknowledgement as part of the project, then absolutely stand up for yourself and remind them of what you did during the project. Because I think sometimes people can be intimidated by others saying that when you know very well that they did not take as big a part. So do make sure that you are highlighting your contributions.
Great. I know we're about to run out of time. So what I'm going to try to do is amalgamate this and another question which I've seen in the chat, and maybe spread it between the two of you. So this is a question which is coming from Henny. And he said, should you self-promote to senior management stroke C-suite if you have working relationships with them, or rely on your line managers to carry the message on your behalf? And then there's another one from Olu Odubajo in the chat, which says, great insights. How do you find sponsors? And I think it ties into this one. How do you find sponsors to support your self-promotion? And if your self-promotion doesn't work, what do you do, and by when? So you've got this question, which kind of links into all of that.
Well, I would say if you've got top-level relationships, use them directly. Don't just leave it to your line manager. Always use the top-level ones. Be sensitive though. Don't make it look like you're going over people's head. But if you know them, then absolutely, I would use that direct relationship. But be sensitive to it at the same time. And they will be as well. I mean, they will know that it could make your intermediate boss feel nervous in some way. So yeah, for that question, I would say, yeah, go directly. if you've got the legitimate direct relationship user.
Yeah, absolutely. Skip level engagement is never a bad thing, and with more senior folks, because I always say, especially if you're in a massive corporation, who's going to be in the room when your manager's not in the room and is able to speak on your behalf if needs be. And so if you need to make sure that they're aware of the kind of stuff that you're doing, great. What I would also do as well, just in terms of the line manager not feeling alienated, is, if it's not a confidential conversation, feel free to also just let them know that, hey, I had a chat with so-and-so. Really great chat, and this is what I shared, just in case it comes back and they're like, oh, I didn't know you're meeting whoever. I think that's never a bad thing to throw in there. And with the question on sponsorship, so I think sponsorship is important, and I think we always see that people of color don't necessarily get the same amount of sponsorship potentially as other folks do. And again, this is where if you have these senior level relationships, nurture them, prepare for them. Don't walk into a meeting without having a plan on what you're going to say. Because I've had some folks that say I get a skip level meeting put in calendar with me, and and I'm like, okay, so what would you like to talk about? And it's just like there's no plan, right? So you need to have be specific, come in, so prep for it, and then don't be scared to ask as well. If you need support in terms of wanting to do something or go somewhere, ask for that support, because I'm more likely to turn around and go, well, actually, you know what? I know you want to do X and you've done really great on Y. I can connect you with whoever, if that's what is required in the conversation. So just do come in with that idea of what do you want from the person that is, you think might be a great sponsor, etc. So just really do think about that.
And I think just to link back to an earlier question, I think this point I made about different levels of organisations, what you do may appeal differently to them. It's particularly important if you're doing something that's going to appeal to the firm as a whole, to its image, because you've won an external award, for example. That's when the people at the top of the shop need to know about it. And that's where your immediate boss may be thrilled for you, but may be less likely to push it upwards. So, think about that. And as Pendo says, keep all the bases covered and talk to your intermediate boss as well, just so they know what you're doing.
Great, thank you very much for that. And this is one more quick question before we end. It's coming from, I think it's Kira. Can you tell us what to do when your manager and or the organization doesn't really do anything with appraisals? It's just a tick box process. Where's a good place to self-promote?
It's tough when people don't do their jobs properly above you, isn't it?
It is a tough one.
What do you do? Sack your boss? You can't do that, can you? So very easily. Clearly, if people don't use formal systems properly, which I interpret the question to mean, then self-promotion becomes arguably even more important, because it goes back to what it was like before we had all these systems, which is an era that I do remember. Personal relationships in the end are always important, and where I think a lot of people sometimes struggle is they don't really know the people they need to promote to. So building strong relationships in the office becomes even more important when you don't have the formal systems that have been built over the years to rely on. And that's kind of how we used to have to do it. In the pub, of course, a lot, which often people didn't feel comfortable with, but had to do anyway. But mercifully now, more people do follow the formal systems, and it should make it a bit more even. But personal relationships count for a lot, and always will, I'm sure, even in the days of virtual communication like this.
Yeah, I can't add much to what Paul said. It's a shame to hear that they're not used properly, but think of alternative ways to get your message across.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Paul and Pendo. It's been a really insightful session, and I'm seeing the feedback in the chat function as well. Thank you. It is much appreciated. What we're going to do now is go for before we go, how can people connect with you on social media if they wanted to follow up or do anything like that? Paul, to start off with, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
I'm on LinkedIn, Paul Monekosso Cleal, as you've got on the screen here. Also on Twitter as well. Cleal's a fairly unusual name, so I'm not hard to find. And always welcome.
And I am, on LinkedIn as well, Pendo O'Donohoe as spelt, and happy to connect. And thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
No, thank you again for your time. It is much appreciated. We're now going to take a quick break, and then in about 5 minutes start the next session with Dion Shango, who is the PwC head of Africa. And I think, Paul, that was one of your roles when you were at PwC, if I recall correctly.
I was on the leadership team, yeah. So Dion was head of the Southern Africa area when I was on the leadership team, yeah. So not seen him for a while, so sure you'll enjoy hearing from him.
Most definitely, most definitely. All right, thank you for your time all, and I will see you all shortly.